Welcome to another episode of Bites of Wisdom. I'm one of your hosts, Ozzy Monroe. In today's episode, Jeremy and John discuss the complexity of complexity. They also cover some other technical topics such as system and service-oriented architecture, while continuing to weave the topic of complexity into those discussions as well. As always, we love getting your feedback, your suggestions, and your ideas, so please keep those coming. Our email can be found in today's show notes. Hope you enjoy the episode.
But one of the things I think this we've been covering a few different topics, getting to the complexity. So
this is something I want to talk about because I've been thinking about this nonstop for days now. And I want you to open the meeting, but I want you to open it up. But it's literally I just can't get rid of. Why are we not talking about complexity more in every time we're planning, thinking, or doing anything? Because it seems like people use every term besides complexity because they don't want to seem like, oh, it's hard. But no, let's talk about how much we can absorb.
yeah, I mean, using the topics we just talked about, right? Very rarely is the argument. I mean, let's just pick something like in the government. Very rarely is the argument about the complexity of doing something. Like the argument really isn't like about the complexity the people that need to implement it are talking about the complexity of the electrical infrastructure and how much it's going to cost and how much time it's going to take, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the thing that's stopping it from happening. It's not the complexity that stops it from happening. It's other factors, and those other factors are what people tend to focus on
Yes.
in the conversations. And until the decision is made to do something, usually by people who are either higher ups, management, politicians, governors, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. They made a decision, voters voted, we're doing it. That's when they start thinking about the complex.
I'm going to bring it to a much smaller scale than we can come back up because I like to kind of adjust it down. Team planning, and you're planning on a project. We need to talk about complexity there.
Yeah.
We need to talk about complexity like, hey, let's do a feature flag for this. And I go, great, what's the sunset for it? Because that's an infinite amount of complexity you want to add on. It gets more complicated as you keep on doing it. So how do we sunset it? What is the timeline and the lifeline? How long do we want this to live until we remove it? That's great because code, we can add those in and remove them, and it's relatively simple. But we never talk about it in those terms of how much a team can absorb in complexity. What's their quota for experimentation and complexity? And I don't know why.
I'm going to push back and say, we never talk about it. So when I have teams that I operate that work either directly if it's a small team or a large team, thinking about layers of complexity, and generally a lot of the conversations are about how these things are how they can get scheduled or slotted against all the other data. I think what you're referring to is slightly different, where you're talking about how to approach complexity when you're building something or implementing something or operating something. And I think of it more as like a business or optimization, like a process optimization. So let me give you an example.
Okay.
So inside of Scrum, probably every other freaking offshoot of it, you talk about estimates, you talk about t-shirt sizes, you talk about people hours, sorry. And that is complexity, right?
Yes.
We're basically trying to get it to a number where we can use it for, can I plan this? And then people who have been in the biz for a while know that you all have you have a feeling based on the team that's executing how accurate they are in their own planning, right? And then how that team interacts with other teams. And listen, there's no number, despite with McKinsey and whoever is going to tell you, there's no fucking number that's going to tell you, yep, this thing's going to be done on the 3rd of fucking October, Tuesday next year. Not going to happen. And it doesn't matter who's going to actually plan it. You're always going to have slippage, or you may even have things that take a shorter amount of time. But ultimately, what it boils down to is you're asking the people to measure complexity of the task that they're going to do themselves. The problems aren't usually the one-to-one system. Tell me how long it's going to take you to implement the widget, or how long it's going to take you to paint it gray. It's never that. It's take that gray box and put it into the bigger thing that 3 other teams have made, and now bring that thing to market. And when am I going to be able to sell it to a customer?
And that's my point. You're actually hitting what I would talk about, was because complexity needs to complies now in what you're working on task and what that means in the future. And so I use the feature flag as the example of something that increases complexity until you get rid of it forever. Because you have an FL statement that is going to be like, hey, you don't like,
Yeah.
when you start, it's an increase. How much depends, but it's going to be a forever thing until it's removed. That's just a fact. So, but these things aren't talked about like that. We don't, that's what I'm sorry. Well, totally, but we rarely factor in over time complexity. And that's what I think we use bad terms for it. We call it tech debt. We call it legacy. We call it a lot of terms.
But
it's all the same. It's just complexity that we've not removed from the system. We left behind. And I don't think that's a good way to think about it. I think it is, this is the complexity we have. We can let's say we have a team and we are managing a project. We can have 10. That's all we can do. I'm making these numbers up, given 10 on the complexity score. How do we think about that? How much experimentation can I do when I have a tech debt pile that's gotten me to 7 on my magical made up number, and I still got to add more features? Well, obviously we need to have a conversation around that, but it doesn't ever seem to be around what that, a more complete idea that I'm trying to suss out with this conversation.
So the way that I think about these things, and in my career, I've gone into the product organizations, several engineering organizations, several times, and had to quickly understand the product, how it's built, the complexity, the interactions, et cetera. It's most of the time, the problem is because things are built, I don't know, I hate using the word silo. They're not necessarily built entirely separate, but they're built at different times by different teams. And because one thing costs, let's just say, $20 or $30 million to build, people, et cetera, there's this adverse reaction to, yeah, we need to get rid of it, and we need to throw it away, and we need to experiment. And maybe the thing that we built that made us billions in revenue could be a hell of a lot easier to operate and much more efficient, and then be the basis for a platform for the next 20 years. And the people traditionally that make those decisions do not understand the complexity behind software systems. Just like if you were to take me or you or anyone and say, hey, great, John, it takes us, we'll use Elon Musk's example, it takes him maybe, I don't know, a couple days to build a car. You got to tell me how to build it in 3 hours. Like, that's just, you can't do it right now. We don't have the capability to do it. And that's not the right question to even ask, right?
Right. But I think you're hitting on the edge of what I'm trying to push for. Is I'm tired of the reason why. So now I'm going to reveal why I'm tired of talking about the tech conversation. I'm tired of talking about legacy. I think it's a dead conversation. I think nobody listens anymore. I think that it is literally going to be engineering talking to engineering and bitching about it, and then everybody outside of those departments doesn't give a shit because it doesn't mean anything to them. They don't understand. Sometimes you'll have a CTO, sometimes you'll have a CIO that's good enough at saying, look, we have to buy these down over time. We want to develop adaptive faster, blah, blah. But most of the time, it's just deaf ears. Nobody's listening because they've heard it for the last 10 years. And guess what? They still made money. And the inverse is, but we're getting when I help some companies, I look at some of this complexity or this tech debt, and I'm like, they need to get a hold of that. There needs to be a conversation of how to burn down, not all of it, some of it, make rational choices about it, talk about it in a way that people can understand. Hey, this is accumulating. This complexity is not going away unless we actively work to get rid of it. People do understand that, the complicated systems beget more complicated systems. They don't understand that tech debt begins more tech debt.
Yeah.
And it's literally trying to change the terminology just enough so that we can have a more complete conversation about getting some of these
So-
things fixed.
Do you think it's the terminology or so? Often I try to use analogies when I'm talking about software because you kind of have to put in perspective for some people. They will understand. One of the things that I find that humans protect their turf, right? And it turns into often a use the word religious war, but only because people know what it means. It's not an actual religious war where people are fighting battles that really are because to them they put a lot of human equity, their own equity, their time and into building something, and they don't want to see it torn down. That's one camp, and that's a big camp of people. And it might be several different reasons. It might have made a lot of money. It might be people that are trying to exercise power inside of an organization, and they're worried about losing control over a team. Like it's layers. And then the other side of it is that sometimes what you're doing, the problem that you needed to solve isn't easy to actually dig out of from a technical functional perspective, like the actual things that you need to do, because you're integrating with multiple teams and systems and companies, and like it's sometimes not even possible. And one of the example that I would point to is IPv6.
No, I think that's a great example. I think it's a perfect example of a better technology in many, many ways that everybody worked around because why the fuck do I need it? Because, oh my God, I found that and I can keep on going. And why do I need to learn something new? And there's no value in it. And they were right. The IP version 6 is fundamentally should be, it's still coming slowly because we are going to keep on adding, even IP version 4 will fall. But they were right. The part that I'm having trouble with is I don't think we pay enough attention to it, the complexity at all the time. And that's it. That's literally it. I want to start thinking about a conversation happens a lot more often about what will this mean towards our complexity in the future. And not just like, hey, we got to do this not to have tech debt, or we have too much tech debt, or like that. How do I make it so like, hey, look, you want us to do great things? This is going to take lots of new features. It's going to take a lot of new complexity, and I'm happy to do it. But understand, this is what it's going to cost you. It means we're not going to pay down this complexity, and we're going to grow our code base, and you're going to need to hire more people.
So I'm gonna step back because yes, everything you're saying is correct, and we've both been in this for our career. Like our career has not been in has been in building technology, solving problems, but most of you and our career has been being the person that explains why these things need to happen, and then goes and executes with the teams to do it. And the thing that I would point to that is the most critical here as a technologist is when you are trying to build something that especially at I'm going to call it company scale, like something you want a company to use and operate for a long period of time. You need to think about much more than just the technology.
My God, yes.
You need to think about change management. You need to think about incident management. You need to think about how this thing's going to be managed from an operations perspective. Who's going to own the code? How does it even get from the person's laptop to like the development environment? Like there's so much more than simply what language is it? And can I use, I don't know, Memcache or Postgres, or can I use the new NoSQL database, TickKV or something? Like, great. All that stuff, that doesn't matter. What matters is how are you going to organize the contract, the service contracts. And one thing that I would really, really, really like to point out from a technology perspective that I don't think you've heard of, and I didn't hear of for a while ago, and I haven't used it yet. So this is me reading into something that I think is getting to where I really need in my own organization, something called Backstage.io.
Oh, I've seen Backstage.
And the best way I can explain Backstage is it's basically a way to share the way that you build software, the methods that you interact with other services, and how you document that software. And if you're familiar with ITIL, CMDB, and these kind of systems, it's basically that their aspirations are to be that for the software architecture and services for large organizations.
Standardized documentation interface. You want to go see what the API is for system whiz bang. See, you go to Backstage. You want to go see where the example code is, go to Backstage. You want to see run the Postman example scripts to see what happens in dev, go to Backstage. You want to see what metrics get emitted, go to back. And you see this repeat pattern where you create a cohesive development environment that people can discover things. And I haven't been in an organization that's been big enough to need that in a couple years. It is an awesome tool even by yourself.
So yeah, it's an awesome tool by yourself. And I could say that personally, my side projects, I use various forms of the same thing for myself. And for me, the latest one is protobuf buff.build.
Oh, I haven't used that in a while.
It's awesome. But I'm not going to go too much into that because I could talk about that for a while. But the whole point behind it is it provides a consistent documentation development layer. I don't have to build clients. It'll spit out clients for multiple languages, a whole bunch of automation for things that I don't need to care about. And the best part about these things is that if you do it the right way, you don't have to argue about the language that someone wrote their shit in. Like write it in whatever you want. Like use the transport, the layer 7 or whatever. And actually that's how people communicate, right? And Backstage is not the way, that is not going to tell you how to do that. It's going to give you tools to organize that information.
Backstage is for the humans, Buffer is for the humans too, but make it so that the humans have to do the minimum possible to access another service.
Yeah. And you mentioned like you haven't worked somewhere in a while. I mean, all the big places do this, right? Meta does this. Google does this. They use gRPC. They use protobuf internally. They do it themselves. I don't know the tool that they have. Amazon, the whole thing with XML, RPC, SOAP, and HTTP, the big, was it Werner? What's his last name? Anyway, the big thing that he said that everything, he got Jeff Bezos to say everything must be a service.
Yes.
That the whole reason was that to put it, to lay it down and say, this is what you're going to do. I don't care what you write your language in, but you need to be able to communicate with each other. And yeah, I mean, if more people did this, if you did this in your organization, even if it was 20 or 200 engineers, you're going to make them more efficient, period.
I do think choice needs to, I have and this is just a philosophical thing for running a software. I think you need to remove more choice from developers.
I agree.
And so like Buff, like you're talking about, you can generate protobufs and but your organization doesn't need Clojure, Perl, Scala, and like 16 other languages. Mm-hmm. You need a few of them because there's a right job, task for the right job.
I'm gonna actually do a quotes real quick for an organization that has a lot of tech debt. Not saying I work at one, but for places that do have a lot of tech debt, protobuf and similar technologies are actually really good because if you do have a lot of COBOL, Perl, or anything like that, if you could generate bindings for new code, that's an easy way to start breaking things apart and modernizing them.
It's a great way to move in the direction. I mean, I'm never going to argue against protobuf, ever.
Not protobuf, anything that generates bindings in multiple languages.
I'm going to say anything that is repeatable and isn't XML and isn't JSON. I have an undying hatred. I love JSON, but it's really goddamn hard to get people not to fuck it up.
No. So I'm gonna push on you both for the protobuf and the XML part. The problem isn't with either of those. The problem is with a schema. You need a schema. Period. Doesn't matter what the language is. If you don't have a schema,
JSON schema doesn't count.
No.
XML schema doesn't count. Come on.
Listen, I worked at an organization where XML schema worked perfectly fine. There was nothing wrong with it, and it does its job. It does its job. But
how many implementations have you come across that are consistent and reproducible across languages?
But that's not an XML or schema problem.
No, it's not. But I mean, that's the advantage of protobufs is that by and large, if the language is supported, it works as you expect.
So now we're going to get an interesting conversation. The protobufs gRPC, there's a reference implementation. So there's two different, gRPC and protobufs are two different things. So,
yeah, they are.
So if you're referring specifically to protobuf, let me just make sure. Are you only protobuf?
I wasn't doing the gRPC because I knew there were some nasty edges on the corner of that case.
So, so protobufs in particular, version 1, 2, or 3, yes, I mean, pretty much guaranteed it's a binary format. But XML, yes, you're right. But most places that do this, they use BDR, or they build it into some intermediate form that they send over the wire. They're not sending XML unless you're using SOAP. So,
I'm not laughing. I'm not laughing.
or XML RPC for that matter. But the point is that if you're going to do this, have a schema. You want a strongly typed schema that is versioned.
Oh god.
And
Yes.
ideally, you would have a application like a framework, like a gRPC Thrift or whatever, that handles versions at the routing layer. gRPC does not do this.
No. I wish gRPC did. I also wish gRPC had a concept of invalidating versions over
Mhm.
time so that you could deprecate them. And as you deprecate them, clients would be given warnings over periods of time and whatnot. And they'd be like, compile error. You only have 2 fucking months left if you recompile the software. And then once they hit the gRPC, hey, this schema is not going to keep on going. Prepare yourself.
So there's some, I mean, listen, the more of what you just, in order to get what you just asked for, it requires a lot more than simply, I mean, obviously you're going to need to have a whole deployment mechanism for that to work. Like, it's not just managing the
know.
versions and the thing
You need something more complete.
you would.
Something, maybe something where you can centrally discover them, then you can make an implementation of them.
Doesn't
and
need
then
to
you
be
can-
centrally discovered, but
It's
but
really
you
helpful if it
definitely-
is. Because
It's really helpful if it is. Yeah. And
I always wished I knew every single client, which client was calling with what version.
mhm. I mean, that would be great. That's one thing that GitHub actually did with their API. They didn't know the client. Well, I mean, you could,
I mean, they know
what
the
client you're on,
service,
but they knew
foreign
the
service.
version that they're calling with. And yeah, so that was one of the things they did originally with their APIs. That yes, if you're able to do that, 2 things. You need to be able to handle headers and trailers, and you need to have a context that can itself be versioned. And if you have those 2 things, the envelope can be what the fuck it wants. But I've yet to see a RPC framework that does everything that needs to be done, because it requires so much. It requires so much effort. It requires so much limitation on the decisions that people need to make further down, that people just don't want to do it, because they're like, oh, I'm gonna have to means that I won't have my software a certain way. I'm gonna have to deploy it a certain way, and they don't want to make that concession, so it never happens.
But it should.
It absolutely should. In the ideal world, you would have a single way to deploy 80 or 90% of your software. The person that's writing the software would not have to worry about deployment. There'd be a team that manages deployment of 80% of the software, and it would be a very small team because everything should be automated.
And if you're not in that 80%, you better have some real good reasons why.
Yeah.
And they're easily understandable. Oh, I need X, I need Y, I'm doing blah, blah. Well, great, that makes sense.
And you should be able to experiment. You should be able to use feature toggles, feature flags. You should be able to explore doing different things. But the point is that you should not have 80% of your workforce move from one implementation to another implementation without a really damn good reason why. And it's not easy once you have.
So what you just described was talking about reducing complexity for the majority of the application so that they get to work on the part that's actually meaningful, and then they can manage their smaller complexity space in the application world.
Yeah.
And then of course, we're going to hit the really hard problem at some point in time, which is, what about dependencies?
I wasted a large portion of my life dealing with software dependencies, specifically build runtime dependencies.
This wasn't even software dependencies. It's service-to-service dependencies.
Oh, yeah. So I've never even seen a system that solved that really, really well.
I've never even seen anybody even try. Have you seen anybody try that?
I have seen someone try.
You have to share that.
I'll have to dig up They tried. Let me put it. But the thing that's even harder is now managing. So we talked about the complexity, just running a software, we'll call it service-oriented architecture. That's complex, right? Like we could walk through, they could spend hours talking about this. Adding even more complexities is the versioning, the time aspect, right?
Yep.
I need to be able to do things over time. Adding even more complexity to that is now wanting to be able to have the metadata between, so service to service discovery, having headers and trailers and context between the two services, which in of itself is versioned. And then the aspect that's even harder is now deal with identity access management. And then identity access management over time.
Now, so now you've hit my complexity threshold of nope. You said identity access management over time.
So
okay,
so let me give you an example.
That's hard.
Let me give you an example.
I love that problem, by the way. I'm going to go thinking about this all night.
Think about the problem, because here's the thing: in certain systems, even if you change the software, even if you run the software at the same time, the identity system could change and you might not be able to do the operation you needed to do, or you need to replicate the operation that you did 7 years ago. 7 years is an interesting amount of time for a lot of different.
I don't know why you selected a number very specifically. Maybe because 7 years and 1 day isn't required to reproduce your calculations?
Certain calculations. And yes, the point is that, listen, like in order to do this correctly, it is hard. It is not easy. There's a reason why we pay accountants a lot of money. And it's the same type of situation with software engineering and architecture. And I hate that word architect, because most companies, they're not doing real architecture. They're not doing what we just described and thinking about those problems and then solving it for hundreds of engineers. That's an architect.
I've met very few. You also hit my most important thing of all time whenever I meet with a vendor. How do I know how to ask this question over time? In the security space, everybody's like, well, what do you mean? I go, I'm doing incident response for something that has happened 3 months ago. Can I understand the state of that Kubernetes cluster at the time of compromise? And they go, what do you mean? I go, that cluster changes a lot. Everything I'm looking at now is useless. I need to know what it looked like 3 months ago. And they're like, oh, nobody's ever asked for that. You go, then they're idiots.
And listen,
that's why that's why you always end up trending. Well, at least log details have timestamps so I can look at them based on what happened at that time.
And any CIOs that are listening to this podcast, you can use that same concept, that same information. I can tell you that your vendors that are charging you a lot of money, they ask that information because they want to know how much to charge you.
Yes.
And how far back they can charge you for that amount of capacity.
I met with a vendor last week, and they're like, great, what product should we build into our product? Blah, 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 doing all that. I'm like, time. And he's like, what do you mean? I go, if I could take it and slide back and select the time and go, this is what, I mean, it's a pretty common product. It's Wiz, great product. And then like, great, let me go back. Let me look at your graph 7 days ago. That's infinitely valuable. It's so useful. And then now on top of that, you have to store more data, but you can charge, hey, you want to charge more for 7 days? How about for 24 days?
I mean, and even, I mean, listen, like most tools that we use, and I say we, all of our jobs, the time component, the time aspect in any organization is usually one of the most valuable things. And getting an accurate state of what the data was at that point in time means that you could solve problems faster. It doesn't matter what that problem is. That problem could be
anything.
How
many places have you seen where NTP doesn't work?
Not that many. But now I've seen it not work at a particular point in time, which is ironic, but not work entirely.
For years, I have a particular problem with Windows Active Directory, and it's, we only need time to be accurate within a Kerberos ticket window, so that's all we're going to guarantee.
Yeah. I mean, I thought you were going to go and we were going to spend we're over time, but spend the last few minutes talking about PTP.
Talked about one of our shared friends, Rick. He told us about, have you ever looked at White Rabbit?
That
White
name sounds
Rabbit
a lot
Time
familiar.
Protocol.
No, he's just getting. You're gonna put something in my head now. I'm gonna not go to sleep tonight. Am I?
Yeah, you're not gonna sleep. Go look up CERN White Rabbit. So they have their own implementation to keep accurate
Like
time
atomic
over
clock?
distance.
Because
It's-
of the
No, well, they can use a source of an atomic clock, but it's basically more accurate P2P without all the dumb shit.
so like
Oh,
no Lampert clocks, like none of the vector clock stuff.
it does. I don't think they do vector clocks, but check it out.
Okay.
It's reasonably priced, built on standardized hardware, where they just monitor timing in hertz, and they can detect the change inside the Ethernet chip to see variance, and they use that and just measure.
So I wanted to end the conversation on something that I don't know if this is a new thing, but I wanted to talk about ideas that you have for shoehorning functionality into other products, and
Oh,
if you've done it before, what are the things that you've done, and etc. So
what do you mean,
go
like
ahead.
vendor products and trying to get them to do
I'm gonna
things? Or
I'm gonna open the first one with something that I thought of that was entirely like blew my mind, and I've almost written a little program to test it out. So I've talked a lot about I like racing sims, right? And don't ask me why, but it was 3:00 in the morning. I went down the rabbit hole and I was looking into how MKV containers, the actual like containers for video is laid out, video and audio. And
AKV, wait, MKV, like
MKV,
okay,
like
yeah,
WebM.
we're all the way down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, we're going down a rabbit hole. So I was really bored one night. Well, I guess one morning, and I went and read about VP8, VP7, VP8, or VP8, VP9, and then got into WebM. I'm like, oh, WebM, this thing never works whenever I try to use it, and then and then go all the way down to it's MKV containers, which most people are familiar with since you ever rip DVDs. I mean, backed up DVDs, and the interesting thing about MKV containers is that audio tracks and video tracks, they're pretty much implemented the same way. Things like chapters and cues and sections, they're all pretty much, again, it's a binary format. It's easy to look at. They have an interesting attachment section and a data track section where in my head, I'm scratching thinking, wait a second, why don't any of these companies that track telemetry, video telemetry, like sim racing, just ship the damn sim racing telemetry with the video?
Oh,
And then have a dashboard cam that just says, here are the throttle inputs and here are all the other data tracks. And it's a very easy way now to.
not only that, because it would be time lined up because they guarantee their frame lineup so that you can. There are going to be some time segments that you can't guarantee, but those are going to be a small window.
It gets even better if you dive even deeper into the things that aren't implemented in most libraries, because I did. They also include the ability to publicly sign all the data of the tracks. So, or sorry, not the circuits, like the tracks inside. You could sign the track with a private key to prove the origin of where it actually was produced.
So you could, but you're like, I want to repeat back what I just heard is that you could record the telemetry and the video of a race and have it signed to have an attestation of where it was generated and recorded from, that you could send it off later and then it could be replayable in esports format.
It could be replayable. Yeah, absolutely.
And you can do multiple heads. You can do whatever you want because you have the full telemetry. And not only that, is you could have multiple camera angles because I know the MKV has infinite number of possible streams in parallel.
More than that
can come and join. Oh my God.
More than that, because it even includes a section for your damn menus. So if you wanted to have interactive menus and ship it with the fucking container, you could. Like Beth Lap, all that shit. It'll run in Videoland.
And then you load it into some custom player. It will also do, hey, we're going to Apple Pro. Like, great, play this back. Custom app will show you the video, but you're going to have different dialogues and dags.
I'm going to go even one more. Time. So again, dove deeper. How races, they use something called, a lot of places use basically radio beacons to know where the race cars are, right, on the track, and a bunch of other things. Now, all the time codes of all the tracks of all the cars that are digitally signed in a race.
They have to be doing something like that in real races.
So they do, right? All the telemetry from F1 and whatnot is done like this, but it's not. They don't do this as a product, or I haven't seen one yet. as a product for people like the other, like people just doing shit on their own.
So you mean like, okay. Like, but I don't.
I mean track days. I mean, people riding go-karts, people.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you could do this if you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars at a racetrack. There's no reason you can't do this on your iPhone.
No, what you're saying is that this format will work for everybody. And if you do it right and you make sure that the telemetry is in a relatively standard, just keep on going. And it just has more options inside of one file format. You don't need anything more. Are you building this?
I mean, I don't know. I got a lot of things that I think about. And I got 2 children.
I called you about a random thing I was thinking about. That was.
I know.
I get those all the time.
This is one of those things where like I see some things that are out there that people try to do things like this, and the tools I'm looking at are actually really awesome. But something like this is like, again, we're talking about eliminating debt and complexity. This is making it even more complex, but it's giving you interoperability of being able to ship the whole damn thing over to YouTube with one upload.
But this also but these are the kind of things that I love. It's because it combines something that's already standard, everybody understands, and he goes like, hey, here's another use case. Stop with these proprietary formats.
Yeah. I mean, or build a standard, that allows you to use codecs, right? Video.
Yep.
You can use proprietary codec, or you can use an open codec.
God, holy shit. Sorry, I was looking at the wiki page for the format MKV.
Oh, yeah. Don't do that. You're going to spend a lot of time. Trust me, I know.
Foobar 2000. I have a Dutch Foobar. Oh my God.
Oh, yeah, dude. It is. So listen, I'm sorry. I'm just going to apologize up front.
Oh, God.
Because I spent way too much time that I'm willing to on this phone. Or
Foobar 2000 still around. They still release it.
Mm-hmm.
Close tab. Close tab.
So, yeah, I wanted to, again, that's something that for me, I think about these things, and I know you do too. Be interesting if we have these kinds of ideas in the future to talk about them.
I like this. I think it's actually a fun thing to talk about, is talk about ideas and connecting things together. And like, hey, what about this? It doesn't mean we're not going to try to make a company out of it. Just talk about it. It's fun.
Yeah. And listen, if someone wants to build something like that, let me know. I don't know if I'm going to do it myself, but
the part that pisses me off when I do this, because I really like my own ideas, like most people do, and then you find out later that somebody already did it in exactly the way you wanted to do it, and you're like, motherfucker.
Yeah, but then for me, that's just, I mean, it pisses me off, but I'm like, yeah, I was on the right track.
It pisses me off, but then I had already started writing solve for it.
Yeah. See, I've learned the part about, I need to do some research before I start just hacking away on things.
No, we could talk about it. Like I was playing with NAT streaming, and I'm like, no, you can build a self-containing binary that can run processes, do WASM, and random it as like a service-oriented architecture, and it could be all relatively version, nice and easy. And I'm like,
oh, Nix.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I remember that. Then I sent John a link about 2 days later where it's like, oh, the company that made NATs also made this entire stack. They, from beginning to end, they can do everything out of the box.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to. So that one in particular, that was a really cool link. I dove through that code and looked through it. It's pretty simple.
It's not, but my code was 500 lines long.
Yeah.
It did most of the same thing.
Yeah, and I think that again, the building blocks for these things, like I think it would be awesome, make a lot of sense. The problem I have with that is the problem I have with most of these things, and it doesn't do the backstage things that we talked about, right? Like often we start from the, hey, I need to solve the problem for the technical problem, and don't think about, okay, well, how do you actually make it so that teams or not even teams, maybe one team with like 30 or 40 services, how are they going to operate this thing? And if you look at, there are very few things that I've found that actually solve or think of ways to solve that problem.
Yeah, I mean, like none of them I've ever come across attempt to solve all the problems we were talking about: dependency, interconnection, version, minor versions, transport, and ease of use, and then try to make it approachable.
Yeah, make it approachable. And honestly, like all the things you just said, like the whole word salad stuff, the most important part about it isn't even like, it's just knowing that shit exists and what the versions it should like talk to R, and then being able to graph it over time. Like, and which request did this hit, which backend did it hit, which version did it follow, like all that information. But that's all the stuff that like it's really about capturing things and being able to query them. Like it's not hard, but again, to your point, it's not easy
It's not
to
easy.
turn it into a something that is now can be used outside by a larger group of people.
And scales and does all the what I mean by scales. I'm not talking about like scale like O1, O2 bullshit. I'm talking about scales to 1,000 people are
Making
using
changes every
this.
single day.
Yeah, and the shipping code's fast, and it's predictable outcomes by shipping that code. That they trust this infrastructure. They know how to deal with it.
Trust is the biggest thing, right? Like trust is the reason why tech debt stays around even when it shouldn't. It's because it's trusted. We know the problems that that system has, and am I going to spend more money for something that might not be as good? You're this person, the other person on the other side is telling me it's going to be good, but I don't really know. So why am I going to spend more money when I know this thing is going to operate?
Now I want to play with that my idea of 500 line codes and build a lot more lines, but see if we can actually add versions to everything. Because nothing quite teaches you how wrong you were by trying it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you got to have a lot of time and be glutton for punishment to do that kind of level of testing. But
It's one of those things where I make enough conversations and talk to enough people that having the confidence of like, I've bumped up against some of the problems myself is useful.
so I'm gonna say I see glimmers of this happening in certain areas. So I mentioned earlier the build buff space, right?
Yep.
And they built basically, if you want to think about it, it's a way to take protobufs, which are just documents that define a binary structure for sending like document or service requests from one to another, right? It's not even service requests; it's just binary.
They have a schema registry like
Schema
they
registry.
did.
That's all it is. A schema registry, and you have the ability to do code reviews, and it'll automatically build clients, and you can then take that thing and reference it as a dependency chain, and
Yep.
now do linting against it, and et cetera, et cetera. So now you have your contract for how you're going to interact with services, and then you can generate clients automatically, so that someone wants to call your service, they don't got to write the code; they just include the library. The next part is the backstage. Like, okay, great. How do people discover? But before it even gets there, like there's this layer of like glue that we talked about a little earlier. It's the layer of how does service A find service B? And how does service A find service B at a specific version? And how does service A find service B at a specific version only for a specific customer? And and you could take customer and include whatever combination of context rules you want to do with it. That part is the part that, in order for it to be really, really flexible, someone needs to figure out a way to do that. And Envoy and some of these other service meshes, they get close, but they don't. It's not. There's a lot of complexity to even get to that point.
They try to abstract without reduce. And what you're talking about is if done right, and it has to be done in total, it feels like pure fucking magic.
It feels like pure magic, and if you and we're thinking about something very specific, but if you have the development environment straight through to the deployment environment, you
Oh my
control that whole thing, then there's a lot of shit that no longer, that no longer that seems insurmountable or might be problems. You have to patch 0 days. Great. You can just click a button and say, fucking build the whole world. Yeah, it's going to take a little bit of time, but
Well, not only that is if you're able to build that fast and roll out new versions, and you can confidently roll new versions forward, and you have, because at some point you have the ability to just wait for people to quietly upgrade. You have your AB blue green methodology by rolling people up a version automatically. You have whatever procedure you need to get them there. You take 5%, you have an automatic rollback. You're talking about everything besides application doing business logic is abstracted away and done as a service.
Yeah.
And then more importantly, an understandable if needed to be, but most of the time just fucking works.
just fucking works. And the best part about all that whole system is we've both seen this happen. That worked, and I've seen it in multiple places. I've seen it with different. It just takes a lot of thinking, and you need someone that can implement it, that has the runway to implement it, and the political wherewithal to be able to argue the steelman argument. What do you mean? Why are you building this thing? It's never going to get done. And then 5 years later, you're like,
shh, trust me. Build over time. Just trust. We're going to do something. It's going to be wonderful. Just don't look this way for 5 years.
I do have faith that eventually the CNCF or some form of that will get us to a cobbled together system that'll work.
I don't.
Yeah, listen, given enough time, I could build something like this with gRPC and like Istio or something. I think someone will do it. I don't know if it'll be picked up by a large number of people, but
the reason why I don't say the CFC will ever build something like this is because they won't immediately there and add a bunch of options to it to give people their favorite thing, a bobber and widget. It takes a benevolent dictator with a vision to say no to a whole lot of things because they don't meet the vision.
It's true. That's very true.
And on that note,
I would love to talk more about this because listen, there's a special place in my heart that I feel like that someone just needs to say, fuck it, I'm going to build this thing and do and eventually get people to do it.
I mean, in organizations, almost all my major success for individual projects has been, fuck it, go the fuck away. And I come back out with something. And then you're like, holy shit, what the fuck he did? He was proving somebody wrong. He was tired, blah, blah, blah. But it's almost always ignoring everybody and doing what I thought was right. And I know that also worked for you.
Yeah, it does. It's just
hard. Well, now it's really hard. If you're diving in and telling everybody to fuck off for a week, things are gonna get weird real quick.
Well, listen, Ozzy wasn't here. We went 50% over our time budget.
Yeah, we'll do
sounds like software engineers.
Yeah. All right, John. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of our podcast. To support us, please subscribe on LinkedIn, Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. We love feedback. You can reach us at feedback@biteswisdom.com. Until next time, stay curious.